You were never meant to hear this story, but now that you have, there's no going back. They called it Angel's Rest, a name that whispered comfort, but it was a lie. In the wet belly of South Carolina's swampland, beneath the heavy moss and humid silence, the Whitworth family built more than a home. They built a theater of mercy, soaked in blood. Between 1789 and 1832, 312 people entered that chapel seeking sanctuary. None ever walked out. Local records vanish. Church documents were sealed, burned, rewritten. Witnesses either disappeared or were mysteriously relocated. And yet, fragments survived, hidden in county archives, whispered through descendant bloodlines, slipped into the hands of men too obsessed to let the dead stay silent. You're about to hear their story. But understand this. This isn't folklore. This is what happens when divine language is weaponized, when theology and power sleep in the same bed, when a family worships not God, but control. Every page of American history has a margin, and in those margins, you'll find the Whitworths. Plantation nobility by title, ritual predators by truth, and their empire wasn't cotton or rice. It was human souls. Gabriel Whitworth, the patriarch, 6 foot, ice-eyed, and void of remorse. A man who believed salvation was found through suffering, and he was the one chosen to administer it. His sermons stirred tears and donations. But beneath the pulpit, in the chapel's hidden basement, lay cells soundproofed with brick and prayer. His wife, Constance, a porcelain specter whose smile could hide genocide. His children, Ezekiel, who studied pain like scripture. Miriam, who could make a dying man believe he was loved. Twins, Cain and Abel, engineers of terror. And young Lilith, the worst kind, the kind who smiled as she learned. Every member played a role. Every Sunday they sang hymns above the screams. Every winter, they buried truth beneath carefully documented lies. This was not chaos. This was not madness. This was calculated theology. A belief system engineered to strip men of identity, cleanse them of rebellion, and turn their flesh into profit. They operated beneath the veil of revivalism, Methodist awakenings, they claimed. But inside the order of fallen angels, Scripture was rewritten in the language of control. You feel that? That pull in your stomach? That's not fear. It's recognition. Something in you knows the world is stitched together by shadows. And tonight, we're going to start ripping those seams open now. Are you ready to descend? History doesn't record the most dangerous truths. It buries them, under praise, under theology, under the bones of the obedient. The United States was young, raw, still bleeding from its revolution. But while the North scribbled constitutions and declarations, the South buried secrets in its soil. Just 30 miles inland from Charleston, in the low country where rice fields shimmered like graves in the morning heat, Gabriel Whitworth planted something far more sinister than crops. He called his estate Seraphim's Grace, biblical, beautiful, and built entirely on blood. You've heard of the plantation class, old Virginia aristocrats, Southern gentry. But Gabriel wasn't a man of tradition. He was a man of correction. He watched his own family's tobacco wealth rot after the war, watched aristocracy falter, and vowed to never suffer powerlessness again. So he reinvented himself, not as a planter, but as a prophet. With his wife Constance, descendant of Charleston's wealthiest slave traders, he created a family legacy not of wealth, but of dominion. Every room of the estate was designed with intent. Every brick was laid to mask a deeper function. The main house stood 3 stories tall, draped in ivy and silence. But half a mile away, tucked into a grove of oaks that locals claimed whispered at night, stood the true heart of the estate, Angels' Rest Chapel. The name sounded holy, but what it held was pure inversion. It was larger than any plantation church had the right to be. 200 seats, though the Whitworth congregation never numbered more than 50. Hidden behind the altar was a trapdoor. Beneath that, a labyrinth of stone and steel, cells, shackles, drains. The ventilation system alone was more advanced than anything in Charleston. Not for comfort, for control. Gabriel preached salvation through pain. Only by descending into the dark, he once wrote, can one ascend in great and he made sure his children understood that creed deeply. Ezekiel, the heir, was sent to study medicine and strategy. Miriam, charm and psychology. Cain and Abel, silence and violence. Lilith, still a girl, was taught to make pain seem like kindness. This was no family. It was a dynasty of ritual torment, dressed in civility. They wore Sunday clothes, quoted scripture, donated to churches, but every prayer was a mask, every hymn a lullaby for the dying. And the community? They looked the other way. Why? Because power protects itself. Because when the illusion is beautiful enough, no one dares peek behind the curtain. But you just did. And what's behind it is only getting darker. Evil doesn't scream in the dark. It whispers in the light, smiling, feeding you comfort while it drinks your soul. By the turn of the century, Seraphim's Grace had become more than a plantation. It was an institution, an ideology, a self-contained religion, wrapped in Southern gentility and laced with theological poison. The Whitworths no longer saw themselves as planters or nobles. They called themselves inheritors of divine order. And the church they built? It was a theater of damnation, not for punishment, for profit. Gabriel preached from the pulpit like a man possessed. Redemption through suffering, purity through obedience. But behind his booming voice and silver hair was a meticulous architect of psychological domination. He didn't kill for pleasure. He harvested for purpose. The victims were categorized, analyzed, and assigned value, like cattle. But worse, because cattle are slaughtered quickly, those who entered Angels' Rest did not die screaming. They died believing they were going to be saved. And that is the genius of what the Whitworths built. A machine, not of death, but of delusion. Runaways didn't stumble upon the chapel by accident. It was advertised, whispered in slave quarters from Virginia to Georgia. Rumors, letters, and false testimonies had been seeded years in advance. Angels' Rest is a sanctuary, they said. Food, safety, passage north. Even passwords were provided, just convincing enough to bypass suspicion. But every step, every rumor, had been crafted by Miriam and Abel with surgical precision. Victims arrived exhausted, desperate, hopeful. They were greeted by Miriam, dressed in white, smiling like an angel. She offered warmth, trust, rest. She asked questions, never seeming to interrogate, always just caring. And all the while, Abel sat in the shadows, recording every word. Names, routes, contacts, maps of the underground, railroad unfolded from the mouths of the innocent. Then came the descent. Each subject was assigned a number, locked in a basement cell, not immediately harmed. First came isolation. Then subtle manipulation. Sarif, Gabriel's brother, would arrive in his long white coat, soft-spoken, smelling of antiseptic and smoke. His tools were not medieval. They were medical, advanced. Pain without mutilation, agony without mess. "We want them coherent," he said once. "Terror must be remembered if it is to be useful." Because the goal was never the body. It was the information, the betrayal of others, the collapse of trust across the entire escape network. And when they had extracted every detail, that's when Sarif worked his other trade, preserving bodies for anatomical sale. Not as slaves, as specimens, to colleges, doctors, and students who never asked where the bodies came from. That's how evil hides, isn't it? Not in shadows, in institutions, in education, in the places that are too sacred to question. Ready to go deeper into the truth. The most effective prison isn't built from stone or steel, it's built from belief. By 1802, the Whitworth family's grip on the region wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, ideological, and deeply embedded in the local psyche. Angel's Rest Chapel had become legend, not just among the desperate souls fleeing bondage, but among the elites who saw the Whitworths as divine instruments of order. And it was working. Every harvest brought more than rice. It brought bodies, broken trust, and blood-stained secrets disguised as righteousness. Gabriel expanded his sermons beyond the chapel now, traveling to neighboring plantations, holding revivals where poor whites and slave owners alike wept at his words. He preached about moral clarity, the sanctity of God-ordained hierarchy, and the redemptive suffering of the unworthy. But behind every parable was a command: obey those above you. Questioning is rebellion, and rebellion must be purified. The terrifying brilliance wasn't in what Gabriel said, but in what he omitted. He never once mentioned the name of the Order of Fallen Angels in public, never referred to Angel's Rest as a sanctuary, never made direct claims. Instead, he suggested, implied, and let others spread the myth for him. That's how real control works. Let them build the chains themselves. Meanwhile, Michael Whitworth, Gabriel's brother, was tightening the infrastructure. He wasn't charismatic, he didn't preach, but he understood systems, distribution, corruption, risk management. He paid local constables to look the other way when strangers passed through. He provided bribes to Charleston port officials to ensure crates of anatomical material moved without inspection. And when necessary, he made examples. A mid-level clerk at the Charleston Medical College once asked too many questions about the origins of the bodies. Within a week, he disappeared. Every empire built on silence eventually collapses under the weight of a single whisper. It began with a name scribbled in a ledger, a name that shouldn't have been there. In late autumn of 1803, a young apprentice from Philadelphia's Collegiate School of Medicine noticed something strange in the documentation for a newly arrived body. The paperwork claimed the deceased was a freedwoman named Esther Rollins from New Jersey, age 34, cause of death, swamp fever. But something didn't add up. The student had grown up in New Jersey. He remembered the Rollins name, specifically a community midwife by that exact name, still alive when he left 2 months prior. Curious, he made a quiet inquiry. The response came weeks later, but it was definitive. Esther Rollins was not only alive, she had never traveled south. The student brought the discovery to his professor, who immediately burned the letter. "You're playing with powerful men," the professor warned. "Some truths are more dangerous than lies." And that's the point where this story should have ended. Another buried truth, another sealed mouth. But the student couldn't let it go. He wrote a letter to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, coded, careful, but the implication was clear. A Southern supplier was forging death records and trafficking black bodies under the veil of medical advancement. That letter reached Jeremiah Morrison, the same man who had already begun his investigation years prior. Morrison had been watching the South Carolina low country from afar, gathering scraps, mapping whispers, tracing the shape of the beast that had no face. Now it had a pulse, a name, a signature. Back in South Carolina, the Whitworth family was tightening their defenses. Word had reached them through their informant network that abolitionist interest was growing. A contact in Charleston reported that someone had been calm. Some ghosts do not linger because they are trapped. They remain because their work is unfinished. Spring of 1804 brought a strange and shifting tension to Seraphim's Grace. The air was heavy with more than just humidity. It was filled with anticipation. The Whitworths had begun to sense it in their bones. The cycle was turning. Their empire, once so invincible, had become reactive. Defensive. But not everyone inside the order felt the same. Lilith had changed. Now 21, she'd shed her youthful innocence entirely. Where once she mimicked Miriam's maternal softness, she had become cold, calculating, and disturbingly efficient. Her particular gift lay in preying upon other women, gaining their trust, extracting confessions, then turning that emotional leverage into a blade. She no longer smiled during interrogations. She didn't need to. Gabriel saw in her the makings of his true successor. Miriam saw a rival. That tension, though unspoken, cracked the family's unity. Miriam, whose pride was rooted in her manipulative supremacy, began altering reports, feeding false intelligence to Abel, skewing records, creating confusion in the system's perfect rhythm. Victims began slipping through cracks. Some gave conflicting information. A few even escaped. Cain blamed Abel. Abel blamed the informants. But Gabriel, he began to suspect the truth. And that made everything more volatile. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Morrison had made contact with a mysterious figure, Reverend Henry Mallock, a former society member who had gone underground years earlier after a crisis of conscience. Mallock had seen too much. He'd presided over false funerals. He'd delivered coded sermons. He'd once personally witnessed a torture session in Serif's basement. And then he broke. He vanished from society, faked his death, fled north under a new name. But now he was willing to speak, to tell Morrison Evie, there are moments in a man's life when time fractures, when seconds stretch into lifetimes. For Samuel Washington, that moment came not with a scream, but with the soft, metallic sound of the chapel door locking behind him. Miriam had led him down a narrow staircase hidden beneath the altar. The flickering light of an oil lamp cast long shadows against the walls. The air was colder here, still. The stone steps were damp beneath his feet, as if the basement itself wept for the souls it consumed. You should have stayed in Baltimore, she said calmly. But you were always meant to find us. That's what the divine does, you see. It pulls the right spirits to the right threshold, and it lets us sort them. At the bottom, Washington saw the cells. 5 iron doors. No names. Only numbers etched crudely into the rusting surface. From within, the sound of breath, ragged, gasping. The kind of breathing a man makes when pain has become his only language. He was pushed inside cell 3. The door slammed. Locked. Darkness swallowed him. But Miriam wasn't done. Outside the cell, she spoke. Not to him, but to someone else. He's not what he said. He's not a runaway. He's educated. Too careful. He asks the wrong questions. A man's voice responded, low and precise. Then we treat him like a spy. Seraph Washington sat in the dark, his heart pounding a rhythm he could not slow. But he began counting. Walls, footsteps, voices. He had trained for this. He had endured worse. He had to believe that. He remembered Morrison's words. You won't stop them, but you'll expose them, and that's enough. Back above ground, Gabriel convened the society's inner circle. The operation was under threat. Too many questions. A dead reverend. Unsettled partners. Something had to be done. We cleanse, Gabriel declared. We burn what's traceable. We vanish for a season. Let the smoke settle. Then When the mind begins to crack, it doesn't scream. It whispers. That's how it started for Samuel Washington. On the 4th night, He stopped praying for freedom. He started praying for clarity. The cell's stone walls wept with moisture. The iron chains were cold against his wrists. But it was the silence that broke him, the waiting, not knowing whether they would interrogate him, kill him, or let him rot. Dorcas whispered fragments from the next cell. Names, faces, directions north that had turned into graves. She said she'd seen Abel once, just once. He'd sat down beside her cell, not to speak, but to listen, for an hour. Then he left. "They study you," she murmured, "like a priest studies scripture. They already know your sins. They're just waiting to see if you'll confess them or bury them deeper." Then came Seraph. He didn't arrive with fanfare, no torch, no guards, just the soft opening of the lock. He stepped into Samuel's cell as if stepping into a drawing room. Thin, pale, the stench of formaldehyde clinging to his coat like a second skin. "Tell me, Mr. Washington," he began in that polished Edinburgh accent, "do you believe pain purifies?" Washington said nothing. Seraph smiled. "No matter. You will." The next 2 hours were not torture in the traditional sense. Seraph didn't break bones. He didn't cut. He simply observed, pressing nerves, measuring breath, tracking eye dilation as he described in clinical detail how many men he'd reduced to truth. "The body," he whispered, "tells the truth long before the lips do." When he finally left, Washington's shirt was soaked, not with blood, but with sweat. His own heartbeat felt like it echoed off the stone dot. But the worst part? Seraph had never even raised his voice. Elsewhere, Gabriel had begun preparing the chapel for cleansing night. That's what the society called it when operations had to be erased. CL. Gabriel once said, "You cannot destroy a soul until it agrees to help you." That was the cornerstone of the Whitworth Creed. It wasn't enough to silence a man. He had to echo your will. Lilith understood this. She wasn't just her father's daughter. She was his refinement. Less fire, more ice. And in Samuel, she saw not a victim, but a mirror. She began visiting him daily, not with threats, not with lies, but with fragments, pieces of truth wrapped in poisoned silk. She told him stories, half lies, half legends, about how their family had been chosen, about how suffering purifies, about how the world was already damned, and only those who controlled the pain could survive what was coming. At first, Washington resisted, not with rage, but with silence. That, too, was strength. But silence is fragile in the face of isolation. Lilith knew this. She waited. Then she began introducing contradictions. She showed him one of the ledgers, his own name, date of entry, details he had not revealed to anyone. The file was exact, terrifying in its precision. It even listed 2 names, Isaiah Washington and Ruth Morrison, his younger brother and his contact in Charleston. "How did you know?" he asked for the first time. Lilith smiled. "We don't guess. We harvest." Then she offered him the unthinkable, survival. "You help us map the rest of the Philadelphia route," she said. "We let you go. You walk out, clean, alive. You disappear back into your life." Washington stared at her. "And the others?" Lilith's face hardened. "We only need one." That night, Washington didn't sleep. He remembered the Quaker motto, "Let your life speak." But what if the price of living meant silencing others forever? Meanwhile, Morrison was losing time. His investigation had drawn the attention of local deputies, men loyal to Gabriel through bribes, favors, or shared blood. A patrol trailed him through Charleston's Market District. His letters were intercepted. One of his informants, a dock worker named Eli, vanished. Morrison understood. They were closing in. He needed proof. Tangible. Unarguable. a way to expose the society that even Washington couldn't bury. He turned to the only place with answers, the graveyard behind the chapel. Not the official one, the hidden one, beneath the chapel's false altar. He made plans to reach it at night, under the cover of the next storm. Back in the basement, Serif had resumed his sessions, less clinical now, more theatrical. He began quoting scripture as he pressed his tools into nerve. God said, "Let there be light," Serif whispered. But first, he carved the darkness. Washington's resolve cracked, not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't a family. It was a theology. And like all theologies, it demanded sacrifice. The rain came at midnight. Thick sheets poured over the lowlands, drowning sound, cloaking movement. It was the kind of southern storm that felt biblical, like the sky itself was ready to confess something it had hidden for too long. Morrison used it. With nothing but a lantern and a rusted pry bar, he approached the chapel grounds alone. The building loomed like a relic of judgment, its Gothic windows flashing with lightning, its cross casting jagged shadows onto the flooded earth. But Morrison wasn't afraid of symbols anymore. He was hunting what the symbols concealed. He'd studied the architectural plans of similar chapels. He knew where hidden vaults were likely to be, beneath the altar, behind the baptismal font, where the dead could rest unseen, but never undisturbed. He found the seam in the wood behind the altar, just as thunder cracked the sky. The trapdoor groaned open. What he saw beneath would never leave him. 12 burial pits, each lined with lime, each marked with numbers, not names. Each pit holding remnants, broken bones, chains fused to wrists, fragments of clothing that had once belonged to dreamers. And beside them, crates, sealed, stamped with fake medical transport permits. He cracked one open. Inside lay a young man, preserved, tagged. The toe tag read, Thomas L. Gray, age 19, cause of death, malaria. Destination, Columbia Medical School. Morrison retched. Then he photographed everything, lantern in one hand, camera in the other, hands shaking. He knew the evidence wouldn't survive long. He had one night, one shot. Meanwhile, in the basement beneath the chapel, Washington sat motionless in his cell. Lilith had been silent for days. So had Serif. But Ezekiel had returned. He didn't ask questions anymore. He made statements. You're going to give us the Philadelphia network. You're going to write it down. You're going to sign it with your name. And if you do, we'll erase your file. Washington stared at him. I thought you wanted to purify souls, Ezekiel, not forge signatures. Ezekiel didn't blink. He simply turned and walked away. That's when Washington realized he was no longer being interrogated. He was being processed. His role had changed. He was now inventory. That night, Washington made his decision, not for his own survival, but for the collapse of everything the Whitworths had built. He began tapping on the wall of his cell. Slowly, rhythmically, it was Morse code. He had one chance to make it reach Morrison. But Morrison was already on the move. He had the photographs, the documents, and the last surviving letter from Dr. Thorne, referencing a shipment due the next morning. He was ready to burn the Whitworth name into history, not as saviors, but as predators. As the storm raged overhead, both men moved silently toward the same reckoning. Only one would survive the next 48 hours. The dawn of reckoning didn't break gently. It shattered. At 6:12 a.m., a column of smoke began rising from the east edge of the Whitworth property, black, oily, and unmistakably chemical. Morrison had lit the first fire, not to destroy evidence, but to force movement, to break the illusion of order that held the estate in its hypnotic grip. The kiln was gone. The crates were burning. The trail of ash led directly to the chapel. Gabriel Whitworth was shaving in his study when the smoke darkened his window. He stared into the glass, as if trying to see through time. Then, without speaking, he walked out. No panic, no urgency, just resolve. He had prepared for this. The family had a protocol. Within 10 minutes, Miriam, Ezekiel, Cain, Abel, Lilith, and Seraph were all gathered in the central hall. None asked questions. None needed to. They had rehearsed this since the first time a bounty hunter turned against them. Burn the records, evacuate the basements, eliminate liabilities, re-establish under a new name. But this time, something had changed. The fire wasn't theirs. It was public. By 7:00 a.m., black smoke could be seen from Charleston. By 8:00 a.m., Morrison had reached the city with the photographs, the tags, and a statement signed by a doctor who'd once looked the other way. Now, facing the collapse of his reputation, he was willing to talk. By 9:00 a.m., word was spreading among abolitionist circles. The Angels' Rest Chapel wasn't a sanctuary. It was a slaughterhouse. But the chapel still stood, and Washington was still inside. Below ground, the air had changed. Seraph had left the door to the lab open. Maybe a mistake. Maybe something deeper. Washington caught the scent. Kerosene. He wasn't waiting for rescue. He was becoming the reckoning. He pulled the cot apart, turned the leg into a splintered spike, and jammed it into the door hinge. It cracked. Once. Twice. On the third strike it gave. He burst into the corridor. Empty. A staircase loomed ahead. Faint light spilled down. Above, the sound of boots, shouting, breaking glass. Chaos had arrived. But freedom was a staircase, and he was ready to climb it. At the top he saw her, Lilith, alone, holding a lantern, no emotion. She stepped aside. "You were never supposed to make it this far," she said. Washington didn't stop, not to talk, not to hesitate. He ran, and behind him, for the first time in decades, the screams at the chapel weren't muffled. They were sirens, wailing, righteous, alive. At 10:04 a.m., the first federal marshal crossed the Whitworth gate. He never found Gabriel, because Gabriel had already vanished, just like the 312 before him. Only now, someone was finally counting. Gabriel Whitworth had disappeared before. Not in body, but in method. He'd studied escape the way others studied war, as a science of shadows. The secret trails through the swamplands, the bribed boatmen, the sympathetic magistrates. He had paid for passage not just with money, but with silence. Silence bought over decades. Secrets traded like gold. But this time, it wasn't just a matter of vanishing. This time, he was being hunted. By noon, the story had broken across 3 states. Philadelphia abolitionist presses called it the Devil's Revival. Charleston's elite were already disowning their connections to the Whitworths. The chapel's ruins, still smoldering, were now guarded by soldiers. Federal marshals had declared the Plantation grounds a crime scene of unprecedented horror. And in a small room inside Charleston's courthouse, Washington sat, alive, eyes swollen but voice steady, giving testimony that would ripple across a continent. He described the chapel, the traps, the lies. He named names. He told them about Miriam's soft voice as she offered poisoned tea, about the coded sermons, the twins' interrogations, Seraph's tools, and most damning of all, he spoke of the files, the records Gabriel had kept so meticulously, names, origins, testimonies, deaths, the evidence of system, not madness, proof that this wasn't impulse, it was doctrine. Federal agents recovered 3 of those ledgers buried beneath the floorboards of the chapel's study, water-damaged but legible. Each one a catalog of despair, victims numbered, indexed, and summarized like livestock. It was more than murder. It was commerce. And still, Gabriel had vanished. But there was someone else who hadn't. Constance Whitworth. They found her sitting motionless in the parlor, eyes glazed, murmuring hymns from a tattered Methodist psalter. She didn't resist, didn't speak. When they opened her prayer book, a folded piece of vellum fell out. On it, the family seal, a winged eye, and a Latin phrase written in a child's careful script. Qui audit mutatur. He who hears is changed. She had been singing it for hours. Investigators searched every inch of the estate, but the tunnels beneath the chapel led nowhere. The medical crates had burned. The basement cells were empty. But deep inside the main house, behind a locked panel in Gabriel's study, they found something no one expected. A mirror, 7 feet tall, black frame carved with angelic runes, covered in bloodied fingerprints, etched at the top, for those who see too much. They called it a vanity, but some of the agents refused to stand near it. 2 resigned within the week. 1 went home and never spoke again. Something was still watching, and in a way, Gabriel never left. There are places in America where time folds in on itself, where the past isn't history, it's waiting, where names echo louder underground than above it. And in the hushed corners of South Carolina's low country, the name Whitworth still stirs dread. Months after the chapel burned, and the plantation was seized by the government, the land itself began to rebel. Workers hired to dismantle the remaining structures reported strange injuries. Tools vanished, ropes snapped. One man claimed he heard organ music playing at dusk, though the chapel had no roof. Another refused to enter the main house after glimpsing a pale girl in the upper window, mouth open, but silent. She vanished when he blinked. And beneath it all, those mirrors, 7 total unearthed from different buildings on the estate, each nearly identical to the one found in Gabriel's study, etched with Latin, blood-sealed. Every one faced inward, as if watching the house, or protecting the world from what was inside. Serif's laboratory contained the worst. A preserved infant in a jar, not human, not animal. An amalgamation of tissue, tooth, and tendon. Wrapped in scripture, labeled Lamb of Revelation. Gabriel's journals, what survived, spoke in riddles. He wrote of visions, of falling stars, of an angel beneath the waterline. He claimed the Order of Fallen Angels had roots far older than Methodism, that they were guardians of a flame meant only for the worthy. One passage, written in charcoal rather than ink, chilled even the most hardened investigators. The body is the bait, the soul is the tithe. We open the door so the architect may return. This is not murder. This is alignment. It wasn't just religion. It wasn't just evil. It was ritual. The Southern Redemption Society collapsed overnight. Ministers fled. Planters sold their land at losses and vanished into Mexico or the Caribbean. Every beer implicated in the ledgers was dead or missing within 6 months, except one, Reverend Josiah Blackwood, found crucified upside down in his church, tongue removed, eyes burned out, a single word carved into his chest. False. Whoever or whatever the Whitworths served had not forgiven betrayal. And Gabriel? Whispers placed him in Havana. then Tangier, then the Black Forest of Germany, but nothing confirmed. No records, no sightings. Except one chilling letter, mailed to the Charleston courthouse. No return address. Inside, a single feather, charred at the tip, and a torn page from a children's Bible. The verse underlined in red, "And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light." 2 Corinthians 11:14. Then, nothing. Not for years. Until someone opened that mirror. It was 1936 when the mirror returned. A Harvard anthropology student named James Carrick stumbled upon it at an estate auction in Boston. No one knew how it had arrived there, just that it had been boxed away in a private collector's cellar, labeled Carolina Ritual Object, C. 1790. Carrick didn't believe in superstition. He believed in patterns, symbols, histories buried beneath myth. The mirror fascinated him, not for its beauty, but its placement in the historical record. The Latin engraving, the discoloration around its frame, the faint scent of sulfur. He thought it was tied to some forgotten American cult. He wasn't wrong. He brought it back to Cambridge, installed it in his apartment. And that's when his descent began. It started with dreams. He wrote in his journal about a woman in white who watched him sleep, about Gabriel Whitworth standing at the foot of his bed, whispering sermons in a language older than English. He stopped eating. He stopped attending classes. Then one night, he vanished. All that remained in his apartment was the mirror, turned to face the wall, and written across that wall, in blood. He showed me the door. That mirror was seized by federal authorities in 1941 under the guise of cultural protection during wartime. It was stored in a subterranean archive beneath the Library of Congress, where it stayed until 1974. That year, a low-level employee, Thomas Marrow, attempted to take his own life, but not before scribbling a final, cryptic message across dozens of interdepartmental memos. They still whisper through the glass. Their house was only a vessel. Gabriel's flame was never extinguished. He is waiting for a key. It's unclear how much of this the government covered up. What's undeniable is that from the 1970s onward, a new pattern of disappearances emerged. Historians, genealogists, religious scholars, all of them had one thing in common. They'd researched the Whitworth family. Each vanished after requesting access to archival materials tied to the Order of Fallen Angels. The mirror was moved again in 1989. Its current location is classified, but insiders have leaked that it's part of a black site collection known only as Section S theories, range from demonic technology to quantum spiritual gateways. But those who've looked into it deeply say one thing above all else. It doesn't reflect your face. It reflects your soul. If this is all a myth, why are the most powerful institutions in the world so desperate to keep it buried? And why do some say Gabriel Whitworth is still alive? There's a reason you've never heard of the Southern Redemption Society in your history textbooks. It's not because it wasn't real. It's because it became something bigger, something more permanent. It changed names. It changed faces. But it never changed purpose. After the collapse of the Whitworth Plantation in the early 1800s, when rumors finally became too loud to silence, the society didn't vanish. It metastasized. Members moved north, west. Some embedded themselves in new churches. Others took up positions in early medical boards, mental asylums, and state legislatures. The blueprint Gabriel Whitworth laid down, control through theology, manipulation through science, extraction through pain, became a model for future institutions. By the mid-1800s, its descendants had names like the Council of Restoration, the American Hygienic Brotherhood, and the Black Table. Different titles, same rituals. They infiltrated the first orphanages of the American South. They experimented on the institutionalized. They pioneered eugenics movements in the name of public health. What happened in the basement of the Angel's Rest Chapel didn't die. It evolved. The tools changed. The sermons became white papers, but the ideology remained. There are chosen souls, and there are vessels. By 1903, internal society documents, leaked decades later, spoke of something called the Seraphim Protocol. It wasn't just a philosophy. It was a system for identifying, grooming, and extracting useful souls, children, prisoners, asylum patients, under the guise of treatment or spiritual purification. These weren't fringe lunatics. These were board-certified doctors, respected theologians, Ivy League professors, men who believed they were building the kingdom of heaven on earth by purging the unworthy. And in every chapter, every generation, the Whitworth bloodline was involved. Quietly. Silent. Lie. Pulling strings through family foundations and charitable trusts. Funding psychological research in prestigious universities. Funding neuroscience programs. Behavioral research. Trauma-based conditioning experiments. The mirror that once sat in the chapel. Its design appears in blueprints of MK-Ultra devices used by the CIA in the 1950s. Coincidence? Or continuity? If you think this ended in the past, you're not paying attention. There are still families in the Carolinas who lock their doors when the wind shifts wrong. Still generations who won't speak of Angel's Rest, who bury the name Whitworth like a curse. And yet, some say the society has moved digital, that it doesn't need chains or cellars anymore. It only needs access to your mind, to your fears, to your faith. Let me ask you again, do you think it's over, or are we just in phase 2? Every society has its shadows. And sometimes those shadows sit in plain sight, beneath polished institutions, beneath noble intentions. The Southern Redemption Society didn't just survive. It embedded itself into the roots of American progress. By the 20th century, it had gone global. In 1921, a document surfaced, sealed by the United States Public Health Service, entitled The Protocols of Redemptive Conditioning. It detailed a pilot study on involuntary compliance conditioning, conducted in asylums across 5 states. On the surface, it was medical, sterile, scientific. But if you traced the funding, Whitworth Trust, Este, 37, the same bloodline, different century. In these studies, patients weren't treated. They were tested, exposed to cycles of deprivation and religious indoctrination. Their reactions were catalogued with disturbing precision. Some broke, some complied, some vanished. The society's goal had evolved. Not just punishment, not even extraction, but programming. To rewire belief, to create obedience so deep it would never even think to question. And where better to test it than in schools? By the 1950s, the Whitworth family name had vanished from public view, but its wealth flowed into educational innovation. They funded behaviorist research, grants to men like B.F. Skinner, pioneers of operant conditioning. They supported military psychologists working on POW resistance studies. And in private, they developed curriculum templates designed to suppress intuition, flatten emotional response, and enforce rote conformity. It was no longer about physical chains. It was about internal cages. And still, no one questioned. Because the society always stayed 2 steps ahead. Every time suspicion arose, they'd fracture, rename, relocate, from the Southern Redemption Society to the Foundation for Civil Harmony to the Whitworth Initiative for Societal Excellence. They spoke in buzzwords: resilience, innovation, public welfare. But the principles were ancient, unchanged. Even today, certain names recur in classified federal funding records. Entities with no websites, no press, but deep access to behavioral tech, AI surveillance, and psychosocial profiling. And what does that mean for us? It means the society didn't disappear. It scaled. They don't need to hide in a church basement anymore. They can do it through your phone, your browser, your feed, because the final evolution of the Whitworth ideology is full-spectrum psychological dominion. Not just control of action, but control of thought. So here's what I want you to do right now. If you're still here, still listening, still breathing in this cold truth, comment the phrase, "I see the mirror." Repeat it twice. Once for the part of you that's still waking up, and once for the part of you that never forgot. It was never just about power. It was about permanence. You see, the Whitworths never believed in endings. Death, for them, was not a boundary. It was a portal, a point of transaction, a tool for harvesting. In 1965, a declassified intelligence memo surfaced from Operation Paperclip, detailing psychospiritual continuity experiments conducted in post-war Europe. One name in the funding trail: Whitworth Biomedical Trust, operating under a London front called the Angels Rest Institute. They weren't interested in genetics. They were studying soul retention. These experiments were designed to determine if consciousness could be transferred or tethered beyond physical death. Victims, many of them orphans or political prisoners, were subjected to cycles of induced trauma, sensory deprivation, and audio-linguistic patterning, rituals nearly identical to those practiced by Gabriel Whitworth in 1791. But this time, they had machines, EEG readers, frequency modulators, neurochemical inhibitors. They weren't just tormenting human bodies. They were mapping the breakdown of the soul. What they discovered terrified even their own scientists. That under enough stress, a human identity doesn't just fracture, it splits, creating subselves, programmable fragments that can be reassembled with precision. That was the final secret. The Whitworth algorithm, a formula for fragmenting the mind, harvesting loyalty, and embedding commands so deep they feel like free will. Sound familiar? It should, because the techniques that once echoed through hidden chapels are now found in corporate HR handbooks, in onboarding modules, in standardized testing, in social media metrics designed to reinforce behavioral loops. The society no longer needs the chains of the past. Today, it builds its prisons in language, policy, and dopamine architecture. The victims aren't only refugees or rebels. They are citizens, students, employees, fathers, and the scariest part? You wouldn't even know you were inside unless someone showed you, unless someone whispered the truth through the cracks in the glass. And now that you've heard this, really heard it, you're no longer one of them. You're something else. Because knowledge like this doesn't fade. It burns, it brands, it transforms. And what happens next depends on whether you choose to forget or to remember. This is the part they never expected you to reach. Most turn away long before this point, lulled back to sleep by comfort, by doubt, by the soft hiss of the system whispering, "None of this can be true." But you're still here, which means something inside you always knew. Knew that the stories they fed you were sterilized. Knew that the world runs on more than politics, money, and science. Knew that beneath every cathedral, behind every boardroom, stitched into every nation's founding myth, lies the same ancient pattern. A family, a secret, a ritual. The Whitworths weren't just murderers. They were architects of a new kind of empire, not built on land or weapons, but on belief, a religion without a god, a theology of control disguised as salvation. What they pioneered in their chapel, trauma conditioning, identity fracture, symbolic obedience, didn't die with them. It scaled. It entered universities, think tanks, psychiatric manuals. By 1982, under the guise of trauma research, elements of their system were being tested on soldiers, dissidents, and even children. Look at the timelines. MK Ultra ends. Family therapy begins. The language softens. But the control deepens. Even today, their fingerprints remain. Ever wonder why certain surnames hold strange political gravity? Or why some philanthropic foundations seem to outlive scandal after scandal? The Whitworth name no longer matters, because their legacy isn't a family tree. It's a framework, and it's everywhere. In how you're trained to obey without question, in how you're rewarded for silence, in how society crucifies those who remember what they were before they were broken. But here's the final secret. The ritual only works if you stay asleep, and you're not asleep anymore. If you've made it this far, I want you to comment below the phrase, "I see the pattern." Do it twice, not for me, for you, because once you speak it, you can't unsee it. Once you declare it, they can't own you. They can surveil your movements, censor your voice, scrub your history, but they can't put you back in the chapel. You've walked out of the basement, past the altar, past the false god, into the light of dangerous clarity. So now, the only question is, what will you do with what you know? Because some truths don't set you free. They make you dangerous. Welcome to your new life. The ritual is over. You are awake.